Hi, I am Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Welcome to my YouTube channel and to this series called Healing Love. It really is about understanding how our childhood wounds can have profound impacts on our relationships and how we see ourselves and how all of those things play out within the context of other humans who can sometimes be quite complicated. So we're talking this week about parentification, and I really wanted to spend an entire series of videos on this one because I think it's very, very common, especially with certain types of family systems. And I would say it's definitely true in more borderline or narcissistic families where the issues remained untreated, in what we would call often emotionally immature families, because at the heart of this, we're talking about role reversal. We're talking about a child emotionally or functionally taking care of adult responsibilities. And what I mean by functionally is doing things like all the chores, all the housework, the physical, practical labor, all of the adulting, right, that doesn't involve emotions. And so in many families, we have to do these things to survive. But when it becomes a child's role and the child is still very much in childhood, we can see profound impacts. So keep in mind, we're talking about emotional and or functional types of parentification. Now, what we're going to talk today about is kind of setting the stage for how this plays out in terms of how we function. I discussed in yesterday's videos the signs, and now I'm going to go a little bit further into what we can see in terms of what the research says and things of that nature. So really what this person is, in many regards, is the emotional regulator of parents. Parents who, for many reasons, from depression to mental health, like I said, to disorders, to substance abuse or chronic health issues, divorces, all kinds of reasons, we can see that disabilities, death of a parent, like the list goes on and on, why this happens. And in many regards, it just happens quietly. No one really realizes it. It's just that's how it always was. Or if there's a trauma like a loss, and you just take over that role. And then you continue, the problem is you continue to play this out in your adult life and relationships. And so the issue is you're the emotional regulator. Now, sometimes this can be the scapegoat child who gets blamed, but they were given all of the responsibilities, but no power. So it can really vary, but I'm really mostly talking about those of you who were called oftentimes, the mature child, the old soul, things like that. And so there can be a wide spectrum of how this plays out. We can see an overlap between the emotional and the functional dynamics. But the core is that the child has to sacrifice development of the child's self in order to take on and maintain these roles. And so what's going to often help us heal is often inner child work, and we'll get to that more later in this part of the series. But usually we don't know how to just be present and play. And so what's happened is that our worth becomes tied to how good we are, how much we provide, and oftentimes we can get really stuck in being rigid and structured. I mentioned how control can be an issue for us. We can often be called too serious because we needed to manage things that adults were supposed to manage. Someone had to do it, right? And so it often has become us. And so what happens is that we can bury resentment and anger and grief. We can bury the ability to interpret and express our own emotions, which can really affect our ability to be in relationships, to have certain jobs or careers, and to find stability, because oftentimes we are so invested in making sure everyone else is okay that we might neglect our own needs to the point where subconsciously we're choosing partners who will end up, playing out these dynamics that, for example, we will have to parent the partner. And then we're going to resent them for that, right? In the beginning, though, we're going to swoop in and love to be the mommy or the daddy or the caretaker in some way. And then over time, feel quietly and deeply resentful, much like we did in childhood because we were put in a role that we didn't choose. But we don't necessarily know how to choose that. And then let's say, for example, as I was saying, stability, we do this, we choose somebody who was never going to be able to provide for us. And so now we're dragging kids with us in a divorce, or we keep having to move cities with our partner who doesn't ever seem to be able to keep a job. And we're secretly and quietly resenting them all of the time. And we're often enabling them because that's what we're so good at, right, is caretaking. But really holding that hurt inside, which can then manifest in chronic health issues, It can manifest in substance abuse issues, addiction issues, and certainly walking around, I would say, with a very high level of anxiety is extremely common. And so that is going back to that hypervigilance. And so we can often see, some of the research says that research has found that when the parentified child internalizes their pain, they may have depression, anxiety, and somatic symptoms such as headaches and body aches. If the parentified child externalizes their pain, this is now, as opposed to taking it in, we move it outward, they may become more aggressive or even violent. Research has also found that parentification is linked to interpersonal difficulties and bad academic performance. I'm not sure about that one. I'll have to read that. I just found this link in an article I read. But I think it could go either way. On the one hand, you might externalize your pain and stop being the responsible one and taking care of your things at school, for example. The flip side would be kids who are extremely on top of things. They're overachievers, almost to the point where they don't know how to, when they're, like I'm saying, in childhood, to take a break and relax because they're so driven to be adults in childhood. Now that can vary. Some kids just have the internal motor, I think, to perform and deliver. It's just who they are. But I'm talking about more of this as an adaptive kind of trauma response. And so what has happened is we have learned to suppress our emotions and pain. And so we can lack the ability to have intimate connections, to be spontaneous, to trust our instincts, and even to be more dissociated, to be just going through life just sort of checked out as a result of not being able to connect to what we really feel, to that grief and pain and resentment. And so as a result of that, we can really start to hold shame and blame and guilt. And that is what I want to set the stage here for what often becomes the symptoms of complex trauma. That is that idea of relational trauma. So parentification is a great example of relational trauma, where we were again and again and again placed in these roles, and we are overwhelmed at the amount of invisible pain we carry, but often have no language and no words and no ability to identify it because it's always been that way. And it can also be part of a generational dynamic where the parent was raised this way and their parent was raised that way, and so it's even harder to recognize in a family system, and then to begin to do some work on that. And so that's the heart of really today's video, is to understand that what's often most important to start healing is your caretaking and your hypervigilance issues, and then to look at that deep sense of self that says, I am bad, there's something wrong with me, and people are not safe. And so I would ask you for today's video to think about, do any of those things I just said feel true for you? Where do you caretake? Where do you find yourself anxious, hypervigilant? Where do you tend to look at yourself as unworthy or not good enough? And how do you really feel about relationships? What do you really believe? Or what is your, if you're saying, well, I believe people are good, but then we look at a string of attachment, trauma, and wounds, a string of traumatic relationships for you, or relationships that just never could get deeply connected. Always, there was always something happening that blocked you from doing that. And so that is really the most important thing to begin to understand in terms of stopping this process and doing your own work. Please take good care and stay safe, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.